So I think the pace of people entering has slowed. If you want to get started.
Okay. Yes, so just welcome everyone and good morning. This is the meeting of the community meeting of the Permit Parking Task Force. And today's meeting is specific for the Princeton High School area plus the Hamilton and Wiggins corridor and some of the other side streets. We are recording this meeting and it will be made available for those to share with those who may not have been able to join this morning, but have expressed an interest in what we're presenting. I'm going to ask everyone who is not presenting to please mute yourselves. The permit, just to give you a little bit of background, the Permit Parking Task Force was established in 2019. This task force has been working on a plan to address the parking needs of residents, employees of local businesses, and visitors, and for the area that we're discussing today, also high school students. The format that we'll be following today. We'll start with Councilman David Cohen, who will be presenting what the task force is considering as far as a permit parking system. And we will then follow that up with seeking your input, follow up with questions and comments. And you will have the option to either raise your hand and we'll call on you if you have a question or a comment, but you also have the option of putting it into the chat function, and I will be reading those in the order that they're received. So starting with David, take it away.
Thanks, Leticia.
And I'm sorry, David, before you start, I actually, I have been asked who's on the task force. So I'll be calling on those who are present to introduce yourself, starting with David.
I am David Cohen, member of council, and have been working on this, as Leticia said, for about 2 years, which I think is a good thing, because I think it's allowed us to really refine what we're trying to do. And the plan has really sort of only fallen into its current form in the last 6 months or so.
Yes. Next, I'm going to call on Michelle.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Michelle Pern-Lambros, member of council and member of the Permit Parking Task Force. I came in a little later in the picture, but we're making some good progress. So happy to be here this morning.
Followed by Scott. You're muted, Scott. And if you can also, when you introduce yourself, share what area you're representing.
I'm Scott Goldsmith. I'm the liaison from the high school. I represent the high school. I'm also a former resident of town. Been on task force since the beginning and here to help out.
Thank you. Mr. Floyd, Michael.
Hello, Michael Floyd, member of the task force. I joined about a midstream. Thank you.
Next, I'll call on Stephen.
Yes, good morning. Stephen Griffiths, been on the task force since the beginning. I live in the Tree Street area. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Jack, I see you're on here. Can you unmute?
There you go. Good morning. I'm Jack Morrison. It seems like 5 years, David, doesn't it? We've gotten to know our grandchildren. Yes, I am the president of the Princeton Merchants Association and a Tree Street guy with the Blue Point Grill and Nassau Street Seafood, and also Witherspoon Grill. So we share the love and appreciate everybody attending today. It's great to see, and as David said, I think with each week and each conversation we've had, we feel that we have a better understanding of how we can balance this. We look forward to this. Thank you. Now I'm gonna get out of you don't need to look at me in my pajamas.
Thank you, Jack. And I guess I didn't introduce myself, Leticia Fraga, also a member of council and member of this task force since the beginning. I do not see any other
Joanne is here as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. Joanne, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joanne, and I'm a resident in the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood and also have a business in the downtown. And I've been on the task force since the beginning as well.
Thank you, Joanne. Did I miss anybody else? No?
I think that's everyone.
Okay, take it away, David. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Everyone see the slideshow?
No.
We're still calling this a draft because we're still taking input, obviously, from the different neighborhoods. But guiding principles that the task force has been working with, which we formulated early on, are basically to try to share available on-street parking resources in residential neighborhoods equitably between residents, customers of neighborhood businesses, visitors, and employees of those neighborhood businesses. We tried to adapt general rules to meet the needs of individual streets and neighborhoods without overly complicating the system.
10:15.
I'm going to ask everyone to please mute yourselves. I'm trying to see who that is.
Mark. Great, thank you.
Okay. Let me see if I can mute him.
Leticia, can you-
Yeah, okay, good. We're trying to make the rules responsive to the varying needs for parking at different times of day and night, and to use the latest technology to benefit all users of parking, as well as simplifying municipal paperwork and enforcement. And I want to emphasize that last point a little bit because the parking technology has advanced a lot over the last 10 years and really makes different things possible than would have been possible even just a few years ago. So we'll get more into that later. Sharing available parking resources. We want to have residential daytime permits available to anybody who doesn't have off-street parking. But if you do have off-street parking, generally, we'd like you to use your off-street parking during the day rather than parking on the street, with the exception that there would be, where it says here 2 to 3 hours. We seem to be coming down to the agreement that 3 hours is preferred, at least in the other neighborhoods. We can talk about that here as well, but 2 to 3 hours of shared parking allowed on most streets for visitors, whether customers of neighborhood businesses or guests of residents, or even residents themselves. So this is the sort of relief valve for point number 1, where I was saying we're not going to make on-street permits available to residents who have off-street parking, but you will still be allowed to park on the street during the day for your convenience if it's a, you know, if you're just popping in and out of the house or whatever. Only on certain streets, which would be located more remotely from businesses, we would have employee parking permits. And the idea there, this doesn't affect the high school neighborhood all that much, but the idea there is to make the on-street spaces available for customers of local businesses. In the high school neighborhood, since there aren't really local businesses that are close by, we're probably not talking about having streets that are excluded from the employee parking permits. But again, would like to hear from folks in the neighborhood if you think there are streets that should be reserved for customer parking and not have employee permits. We will have short-term permits available for overnight guests, for contractors who are doing work that takes more than the 3 hours that's regularly permitted, and other users like that. So, and I'll get more into that on another slide. And then we're looking to adapt those general rules to meet the needs of individual streets and neighborhoods. So one of the things we're doing is to issue residential permits by zone, so that, if somebody does have an on-street permit, a resident does, and they come and their street's pretty full, they can park around the corner. But employee permits will not be issued by zone. And the goal there is to they'll be issued by block, and only a limited number will be issued on each block. And the goal there is to make sure that there are always plenty of spaces for residents and their guests to park, even if employees are unable to park on a block by block basis. One of the other things that's adjustable neighborhood by neighborhood is how generous we can be with residential permits. So in some neighborhoods, we just can't give on-street permits to residents unless they have nowhere else, no off-street parking. But in other neighborhoods where the parking is more plentiful, we can give resident permits to folks who maybe have off-street parking, but it's really constrained. Maybe it's only in their front yard. Maybe it's a really narrow driveway, stuff like that. So the employee permits, as I said before, they're only issued on certain streets, and the number that could be issued is sort of negotiable. We've been talking about 50%. So if on your block there are 13 parking spaces, we would issue 6 employee permits. But that could go up or down depending on the sense of how much, how much demand there is for the other spots on the street. And then, of course, in your neighborhood, the student permits are treated similar to the employee permits, where they are only allowed on certain streets, on certain blocks. Being responsive to the varying needs throughout the day and week, we're making overnight permits widely available, even though the daytime permits are pretty restrictive for residents. Any resident who wants an overnight permit will be able to get them. Parking rules will be suspended on weekends for this zone. In some zones, that's not the case because the demand actually is heavy on Saturdays. But I think in this neighborhood, we don't see a need to extend the permit regime. And I think that's true for you right now, that your permit regime doesn't affect Saturdays or Sundays. Hours of enforcement for daytime permits can be different in different neighborhoods depending on businesses' evening needs. I think we're inclined in this neighborhood to have the restrictions end at 6 p.m. because again, once the students are gone, we're not sure there's any reason to keep the restrictions in place. Here, I want to talk a little bit more about the technology. So not only, so the first item is that we're going to have online permitting, and you will not have to go into the municipal building to obtain permits or renew your permits. It'll be possible to do that on the vendor's website. And and also issues of having like an overnight guest where currently people have to call the police to alert them that, they're going to have an overnight guest on a given night. That will no longer be the case. You'll just be able to hop on and get that short-term permit in real time through the website. Enforcement will use license plate reader technology, which basically means that every permit will be given out based on a license plate. And one of the things I really like about this for the high school zone is that we understand that there's a market in student permits, that there's a lottery system where kids get them at random, but some kids sell their permits sort of to the highest bidder to somebody else. And we really want to make sure that whatever system is put in place, that it's not gameable. So enforcement will be, the permit will be assigned to a given license plate and will be enforced with license plate recognition. But it's not just for permits, it's also for the 2 or 3 hour parkers. Those license plates will be recognized and stored, in the system. And the software will be able to tell if somebody has moved their car. And we can come up with a specific policy that we want. Can you move your car just to a different block on the same street, or would it really be by zone? The 2 to 3 hour parking could be enforced by zone, where we essentially say, yeah, you can park for 2 to 3 hours, but you cannot move your car anywhere within the high school zone without getting a ticket. So that really helps with some of the concerns that I've heard from people in your neighborhood about students gaming the system and parking for 3 hours and then coming out between classes and moving their car. We really have the ability to not permit that. Okay, so here's a map of the neighborhood as we've been talking about it. And we've extended this to include Humbert and Greenview. I don't know if there's anybody here today from that loop, but really interested to hear whether they feel like they can support some employee permits on their street as well. Right now, it's just 2 hour parking on Humbert and Greenview without any permits at all. Okay, so specific to the high school zone, actually these first 2 points are pretty general, that 24-hour permits available to residents without a driveway for $30 a quarter, $120 a year. And you can park anywhere in the zone if you have one of those permits. And then overnight parking permits be available to everyone if you want them. They would have the same price, $30 per quarter. And the daytime parking restrictions we're suggesting be in effect from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then there are a few more neighborhood specific things here. The first one is that the task force has been asked to explore relocating parking off of Hamilton Wiggins in order to permit installation of on-street bike lanes. And some of you may been aware that that's been a conversation on council this year. Hopefully many of you are also aware that we did that as a pilot for, I don't know, it was about 8 weeks. Back in 2018, we had relocated that or eliminated that parking. At that time, we didn't relocate it because there was nowhere else to put it, but we eliminated it for a couple of months to try out on-street bike lanes. And in this instance, what we've come up with is really just what I was describing earlier, that these employee permits would be available for 50% of available on-street spaces. And if you count Humbert and Greenview, the loop I was just mentioning, the first block of Moore and Jefferson, closest to Nassau, to Wiggins and Hamilton, and then Hawthorne Street, which is the first street in. If you make 50% of those available for on-street parking, you get a total of 51 spaces, and 49 spaces are lost on Hamilton Wiggins. So it's basically a slight improvement. And then the 3-hour parking on the remaining 52 spaces, I think, on those few streets will more than replace the 12 spaces that are lost of customer parking on Wiggins, which fall between Van Deventer and Moore. And, you know, throughout the rest of the neighborhood, we could put in the same permissions for employee permits, which by my count could yield up to 150 additional employee permits if we put the same rules in place on all the other streets or all the other blocks of the streets throughout the high school neighborhood. The school administration is asking for the existing spaces, which fall on Gio and Franklin. It's on Gio between Moore and Walnut, and then Franklin between Walnut and Linden. That's a total of 47 spaces. And then they want to add spaces in the locations I've listed here. So because of the loss of the Franklin lot. So Houghton, they want to add 6 spaces across from the high school. On Moore, from Houghton to Henry, which is basically right across from the high school, they want to add spaces there. And for the blocks of Franklin and Henry that fall between Moore and Jefferson, and basically there are no houses that actually front on Franklin and Henry between Moore and Jefferson. If they can get those spaces, they basically get them a total of 90 spaces, if which they feel is adequate for what they want to have for their senior parking. And this last slide is questions that have arisen as we've been discussing the zone, where we'd really like to get your feedback. I'll run through them quickly, but I'll also leave them on the screen so that we can start our discussion with people raising their hands to answer any of these, or also ask questions of your own. So first question is, would you support relocating the parking from Hamilton Wiggins in order to permit the installation of on-street bike lanes? Second question, should streets in the neighborhood that are further from Nassau Street and which currently have no permit controls on them be added into the system? And that includes streets like Oakland, Hickory Court, Linden, Ewing, Walnut between Gio and Valley Road, and Valley Road itself. And I learned this morning from Marco that Harris does already have controls on it, so it shouldn't be in this list. But you know, do these other streets want to have protections added? So my understanding is that currently students are permitted to park on these streets, you know, even if they can't obtain one of the 90 permits that the school will be giving out. We're concerned that the demand for student parking on these streets will increase once the Franklin lot comes offline, because that's been, you used by the students during recent years. So just keep that in mind as you think about whether controls should be added there or not. How should we address the parking needs for longer term visitors? This is the pricing that we're proposing. And I just want to mention that we're charged by the vendor of the software for the online permitting $2 per permit, regardless of how long it lasts. If it's a 1-year permit, we're charged $2. If it's a 1-day permit, we're charged $2 in a processing fee. So we're suggesting for 1 day, it could be a $5 permit. For a 3-day, it could be a $10 permit. And for a week-long permit, it could be a $20 permit. Do these seem like fair prices? Should we have a different system for home health aides, who are low-income individuals and maybe should be given a break? And also, what should the cumulative annual limit be on these permits per household? We've talked about 6 weeks total, but that's definitely negotiable. Should high school student parking not fully saturate the blocks where the permits are given? So this is an important one we want some feedback on. As I've described it, our employee permits would be only for 50% of the spaces available. If it's important to residents that they have on-street parking available on those few streets that have been added under the high school program or the high school's request, it's important to keep some free. We may have to add a couple of additional streets to get the high school up to the number of 90 permits that they're looking for. And this last question is something I just added this morning. I had gotten a request from some residents of Hawthorne on the east side of Linden. Their driveways all discharge to Hamilton, which is a very busy road. And they've requested that they could get on-street permits on Hawthorne so that they don't have to back out into heavy traffic. It seems like a fine idea to me. I don't think there's a lot of other demand for on-street parking on Hawthorne. But I'd be interested, especially if anybody lives on that block and has an opinion about that. I'd like to get feedback. And that's it for my presentation.
Sorry, David, just as you were presenting another, because the high school neighborhood, it's unique in that there's already a permit parking system in place. And one question that came to mind as you were presenting is currently the permit parking for this area, the requirement is only in place during the academic year. So this would be from September 1st to June 30th, where a permit would be required.
Right.
So that's another question. Should it stay just during the academic year, or are we considering having it year round?
So it's a good question. And I think in terms of the employee parking, I'm a little concerned with having that not be in place during the summer because employees tend to work year round.
And they're already allowed to park on these.
That's right. But if we're relocating employee parking from Hamilton Wiggins, then that will change the demand for the on-street parking in this area. So I'm not saying that it has to be during the summer. I'm just raising a concern that I've thought about with having it be seasonal.
Thanks.
So let's get input on that as well from.
Okay. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we'll ask for folks to raise their hand if you have comments or questions. Or if you want to post your question in the chat, feel free to do so.
Marco has his hand up.
Go ahead, Marco.
Hi, I'm Marco Gotardis. I'm on Harris Road in Princeton. I've been a resident of over 20 years on Harris Road. And, I know there's changes, that happen in the city that, that things change. However, I feel a little bit put off about having to pay money to park in front of my own house or to get permits. I don't mind having to get permits to keep everything orderly, but I really feel that this is like cleaning the streets or other things, and that you guys should actually tax the whole city for this. Why should we actually have the burden of this? Because, the high school is there. We understand that. Things change, but why shouldn't the whole city actually fund this rather than the local residents of this zone or the employees that come in or the students? I don't know how much you're charging them, but I just I don't believe that that's the way it should be funded. That's fundamentally my complaint.
So my response, there's something to consider, but my response to that we already do have some neighborhoods where residents have to pay, including the Tree Streets and other, some in the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood, where residents that don't have driveways
Right.
do have to pay for parking.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I'm not talking about only myself and my neighborhood. I think that's fundamentally wrong, because why should we have to fund this entirely ourselves when there's mansions on the other side of town, right, and open streets that don't have this problem, but we're all together here. We're all together with the employees. We're all together with everybody else. And I've never lived in a place where I had to pay for parking. And this is a fundamental change from, my situation and my neighbor's situation.
Can
in general.
I ask, Marco, are you in the situation where you don't have off-street parking?
Well, it depends on what you call, you've defined it a little bit, broadly. I appreciate that. I have a common
reaction.
driveway that I have to go all the way.
Total reaction is it?
Excuse me. I have a driveway that it's not convenient for me to pull in and out if I have to, right? The entire day. It's about 30 yards in, and it's narrow. And for me, it's convenience during the day. It's great. I can park in front of my house normally.
Yeah.
And but and I don't mind getting the permits or what you're suggesting. But it's fundamentally an issue, I think, with governance that I'm talking about, that you guys should actually provide this as a service for the entire city, and it should be funded in a tax-based manner that way.
So thanks for the comment. I'll be interested to hear if other people feel differently about it. I think, my opinion is that it's a demand management question, and that we have neighborhoods where there's no problem of supply. So for those neighborhoods, there's no real need to have a permit system at all. But for neighborhoods where there is a supply problem, if you need that's where you need the permit system, and that's where those neighborhoods.
I totally agree. I just think that the neighborhoods that don't have a problem should help fund this. This should be something that the city should fund. So that's
Thank you for your comments, Marco. Next, I'm going to call on Anita, followed by Alice, and I'll see who else has their hand raised. And then after that, I'm going to go to the questions posted on the chat function.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. A few things. I would echo what Marco just said. I was kind of shocked to find out that, we've had a permit system here that we just had to apply for, and now we'll be asked to pay to park in front of our houses. So I echo everything that Marco just outlined. And I think that was a good solution to suggest that, yes, the whole town ought to be funding this. That's the way it should be managed. This is the former borough. And it's another burden of consolidation that you're asking mostly borough people now to have to fund this parking. So I have some questions just specific to kind of the logistics of this. So we have parking only on one side of our street now. And so people who live across the street from us will park in front of our houses. So this will remain the same, except for we're going to have to get permits to park in front of our house. Is that right?
Yeah, that
So on,
not be any parking added, on
yeah.
street, on having parking on two sides of the streets or anything like that.
So, and we know we're going to get increased population here with the development of Franklin Street lot. So when we had the hospital here, it was an issue, and I don't know whether you considered trash pickup or not, but it was always an issue that if someone parked in front of your trash that was sitting on your curb, it wouldn't get picked up that day. And it would have, it would sit out there the whole week waiting for the next week. So we mostly 100%, I can say, both sides of the street, we put the trash on the street, off the curb, so that people won't park there on Thursdays, so that it can be picked up. So how is that managed if you're allowing people now, both sides of the street, to park overnight, which they will do because they don't want to pull in their driveways, and that's going to obstruct trash pickup. So I think you need to consider that. So, and if I'm understanding the process correctly, you're giving us 3 hours where we can stay on the street, even if we live in that house that we're parked in front of. So if I am cleaning out my garage and I need a good portion of the day to get out of my garage, which is not, I don't have a driveway in front of my house. I have the lane that we mutually share where I have to pull in, and I need to pull my car out of there because I'm having work done or whatever. I've got to now, I can only do that within a 3-hour window. So, and I share a garage, by the way. I don't have a garage to myself. So that I think is a bit burdensome. I may need more time for that. Also, if I'm having workmen come, painters and carpenters, how do I manage that? Now we're both parking in front of the street and I need a permit for them and I need to give their license plate number, and I only have 2. I have family members coming. I mean, I'm not sure how I can logistically manage this.
Yeah, I because we're offering the short-term permits, which will be available online, it should be possible to manage it, but I almost want to follow up with you and find out what your, sort of after the meeting, Anita, and find out what your particular needs are, because if they really are unmanageable, then we would have to change the system. But I think that it should be possible. This relates to the question of, is there a cumulative limit on short-term permits? There's no limit on the number of short-term permits you can get at any given time, at least the way we've been thinking about it. So if you have, if you're having work done on your house and you have 4 contractors coming, then yes, you go online, you get their license plate numbers, you go online and you sign up for permits for them for when they're going to be there. But if this happens a lot during the year and you have a need for permits for family members who are coming to visit frequently, you might need more than 6 weeks worth of permits.
So this is starting to sound really expensive to me, to just have people come work on my house or visit me.
No, I think the 3-hour time limit, there's no permit required for the 3 hour, for someone to park on the street for up to 3 hours.
But 3 hour, I mean, I just had carpenters and painters here that were here all day. It's way more than 3 hours.
So then for that, that's where the visitor parking permit would come into play.
And so
I understand the concern, Anita. I mean, it's true. I mean, if you have 180 days a year of workmen and family visitors. You know, if we extend the limit above 6 weeks and let you buy as many of those permits as you want over the course of the year. But how does that work currently? Because, how does that work for you currently?
So currently, there is not much parking here. There is not much parking here during the day or high school parking because they have the Franklin Street lot. So it really has not been an issue.
Uh-huh.
They will come and they will park in front of my house. I won't even take the permit out and put it in the window because, you know, there's, after the hospital left, there's not a lot of checking of parking and there's a lot of spaces that are open. You know, what we have had an issue is people parking overnight in front of our houses because they're either at Avalon Bay or they're people from across the street who don't have parking in front of their own houses.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that because we have had the question of why do we need overnight permits at all? But in neighborhoods like yours and others like the Tree Streets, there are a lot of people who live in the center of town who don't have any parking at all, and they're paying thousands of dollars to park in, say, the Spring Street garage. And if we suddenly got rid of the overnight ban altogether, instead of requiring overnight permits, we're concerned that we'll have all of those folks leaving their cars in these other, in these other close-in neighborhoods to avoid the cost of parking in the garage. So,
Yeah, well, I'm not.
We have several other raised hands and our time, it's not unlimited. So if we can, thank you for your comments, Anita. And I know it's something that the task force will work to address.
If I could just make one more comment. I am concerned that once the Franklin Street lot is development, what we're deciding today will be a whole different character because there will be people living there who will not want to go into a garage and park, and they may be looking for spots in front of our house. So just bearing that in mind, and then also trash picket. Oh, and lastly, you said this would end at 6 o'clock, but has anybody considered the adult school? And I assume the adult school will still continue once we're post-pandemic. There's a lot of parking in the evening in front of my street on Franklin for people who are attending classes at the adult school. I don't know whether you brought that into your conversation when you planned.
we haven't. Where is the adult school held?
At the
high school.
Uh-huh.
So if I can now call on Alice was next, and then that will be followed by Anthony. And then we also have Bruce and Harold waiting, and Karen. So Alice, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, we have a couple of issues. First off, I think I agree with what has been said before. There's all sorts of issues, and the idea of having to pay more than our $16,000 worth of property taxes, which we pay every year, most of which goes for the high school to pay for students and stuff, and we don't have any students, is already pretty astronomical. But anyway, we have other issues. We have our driveway is a tiny little driveway way back in back of the house, very hard to get to from the house. And it basically can hold 2 cars, which is what we have, and each one can manage to get out. But anyway, before this permit situation that we have now, which is very good for me, I teach classical guitar lessons. Right now I'm doing it on Skype, so it's not an issue, but it will be when my students come back. Then I get a student every hour coming often, very many hours, very many days, one after the other. When before this whole permit thing, which is really good now, what happened was my students would come circle and circle and circle. They could never find a place because the high school kids were all parking in front of our houses, every place. We couldn't even park in front of our own house to unload and load up. My husband loading films for a show, couldn't do it. Got to drag it all back to the back. My students would be coming late for their lessons. They would be dragging their guitars for blocks and blocks and blocks because they were desperately trying to find some place to put their car. And we couldn't really park out in front of our house so that they could park in the driveway. Now with the permit, what we do is we were bringing both of our cars out in front of our house, parking them there for the whole period of time when a student might come. And then the students could park alternating back and forth in our driveway back, which was not ideal, but it's a heck of a lot better than walking for 5 blocks with your dragging your guitar and being late for your lesson. And I had one student who was so irate about this whole thing that he basically wasted about half of his lesson time, most of the time, complaining about the potholes, about the traffic, about the fact he couldn't park, about how frustrated he was, how mad he was, how lousy Princeton was, and etc. And I think if we get this whole permit system, one, how are they supposed to figure out who's supposed to pay? They're supposed to pay extra to park on the street. I have probably 20, 25 students coming
Alice,
a week.
they
Yes.
don't have to pay anything unless their lesson is longer than 3 hours.
It's not, but then how are they going to find a place to even put the car?
Because students will still not be allowed to park on your street, and only a small number of employees will be allowed to park on your street, leaving half the spaces free for guests, for any of the residents on the street, including your students.
Well, it didn't work out that way before the permits. The students came and dropped all sorts of food
I
sandwiches and junk
understand, Alice, but we're not proposing to go back to what was before the permits. We're going to a new permit system.
Yeah, and then we're supposed to pay for $5 a week or something ridiculous for being able to. How about if we would then park in front of our house? We can't do that anymore for more than 3 hours.
Right, but there's no need to, because your students can do that.
Well, if they're, it will fill up. I worry.
Okay.
I worry, and
Thank
that's my business. And I don't earn much and not enough to pay all the astronomical property taxes, I will tell you. But that is not a good situation.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments, Alice. Next, I said I would call on Anthony, followed by, did I say Harold or Harold? We also have Bruce and Karen and Angela. So let's start with Anthony. You can please unmute.
Thank you, Letitia. Thank you to all the task force. I know you've been working long and hard on what is a very difficult problem, and having been involved in other town issues, I know that there's no town issue that is straightforward, and it's not easy to resolve. I want to bring up the issue of how we're going to deal with enforcement, and particularly the license plate reader, which is a very sexy and attractive sounding apparent solution that will solve all the problems. And I'd like to point out that it may not do that unless you have in your budget a full-time or a substantially part-time employee who is going to literally police the parking on all of these streets all the time. 20 years ago, an enormous amount of effort was placed in setting up the residential parking system that we have now in this area. But the reason for that is that the students were at that time running riot around the system. We had 2-hour street parking at that time. And it's almost totally unenforceable. And if you have 3-hour parking, it's even more so. Let's say that a person comes on the street and there's no checking that day by the police, and a resident has to notice that the car is there, then notice again 3 hours later that it's still there, call up the police enforcement and say, hey, somebody's parking illegally in front of my house. Then maybe if you're lucky 1 hour later, the police will come. Then they will record that the car is there. Then they will have to come back again 3 hours after that If you add up 3 + 1 + 3 under the most favorable circumstances, that's 7 hours before the police would be able to enforce anything on that car. And of course, the student will have left by then. It will be necessary to come to each street approximately 3 times a day at a minimum in order to enforce this at all every single day. It's not easy. And if you don't do that, you have what we had, which is why there were an awful lot of upsetting town meetings 20 years ago. We had students on our street. I'm on Hawthorne Avenue, which is just a couple of blocks from the high school. And we would, and I'm not making this up, we had students who would park their car and maybe 3 of them would congregate by the car in class breaks and so on. They would be smoking, they would be sitting on my front lawn or on the neighbor's front wall, and they would deposit their debris afterwards. And I found, on a number of occasions, I found piles of cigarette butts, I found tampons, and I found condoms, and I found other things that I will not describe in a family setting that were caused by this.
Worse than condoms, Tony?
Thing. I don't ask. And so what I'm saying is that if you're not careful, you'll bring us right back to where we were 20 years ago. And this, it's very, very easy to run riot. The students are very, very clever. They have a communication system, what students, whether the police are enforcing that day, what streets they're enforcing on. The whole system completely was useless. So you're going to have to, I think, I know it's difficult for you, and I'm not saying it's easy, but this LPR is not going to be the be-all and end-all unless you actually have extremely frequent enforcement of it every single day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Tony. As David mentioned, we're not looking to go backwards. And with the new technology, and especially like for Hawthorne, your street, I live on Houghton, so I go by your street often. And currently what I see is the only vehicles that I see on a regular basis are contractor vehicles. But we're not looking to allow for student parking on that street. What we're looking is to expand to allow for employees of local businesses, a limited number of permits to be allowed on, for us to share.
And I want to acknowledge, Tony, you're right. It won't work if we don't do robust enforcement. We are very aware of that. We're counting on adding enforcement officers, and that's part of the plan. So you say if we're not careful, we'll have problems, and I'm telling you, our plan is to be careful.
And I would add to that, that, we have, we're not expecting for residents to be the ones that are monitoring. We have someone on the task force, Scott, I see you raising your hand, who's already monitoring that. Do you want to say something to that, Scott?
Yes, I just want to say something in general, the whole thing. Anthony, and I see Phyllis here, many people who did the groundwork to start the permit program back 20 years ago with the behavior you mentioned, Anthony. I've talked to the task force, I've talked to residents, I've talked to the our administration, and we're all in agreement, not necessarily the task force, but my own personal opinion is the culture and behavior of our students is not like it is 10 years ago. All the stuff you had mentioned was true. I myself used to enforce kids who used to have 20 kids on the corner of Houghton and Walnut smoking. Then they would move to Hawthorne after we asked them to come back to school. And then they would litter on Hawthorne and Houghton and Walnut when we used to have parking there. I used to have all parking enforcement myself for students who used to park in a lot. That has all decreased within the last 5 years. I'm not saying kids are not smoking anymore, but they're not smoking on school grounds, literally not smoking cigarettes. It's more of a vaping issue that we deal with now at the high school. The spots that we've asked for have all been in visible range of the high school that is monitored by myself, other security people, administration, with some of the spots that are already been used for our visitors, overflow of our staff, which is used on Houghton and more, which we lost part of our lot with the construction recently. So some of these spots that we've had already have been in use in conjunction with the last 5 years, using that. And the culture that it was explained is just, I keep on repeating it because it's not there.
Scott, you need to go to the Franklin lot. You need to go to the Franklin lot behind our house because it's a mess every day.
Okay.
Scott, thank you very much. It's glad to have you involved with your great experience. Just some of the parents paid the parking fines. Some of the high school students are quite wealthy, not all of them, of course. So that's another issue that needs to be thought about here. The parking fines may be considered by some as a cost of doing business.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that because I've heard that comment before. You know, if parents really don't mind paying $40 a day for parking for their kids, they can do that right now, even with the current permit system in place. So I think it goes back to your concern, Tony, that enforcement has to be frequent. And we're really committed to doing that.
Thank you all. Thank you, Scott and Tony and David. Before I call on, I'll be calling on Bruce next, followed by Karen. But let me respond to a couple of the questions that are in the chat function that are easy to answer. One, will there be a fee for student parking? There already exists a fee for student parking, but it's the school that pays it. And it's a limited number of permits that I think up to date have been issued by a lottery system. So there's a limited number of permits that are made available for students, and the school does pay for those permits. And then the other question about whether the presentation can be shared, we can upload that as well as the recording of this meeting can be made available, will be made available on the municipal website, and we'll notify everyone either through our newsletter to let you know when that's up for those who wish to access it. So next, Bruce, and then followed by Karen. You can unmute, Bruce.
There we go. Thank you. Forgive me, forgive the term. I find a lot of this really kind of ballsy. As a resident of Hawthorne Avenue, and we're one block from the high school, as Tony already mentioned, some years ago, residents of Hawthorne fought quite hard, I was one of them, to have parking on our street largely permit restricted to residents for the most part and their guests during the school year, as it had largely become a convenient dumping ground for student cars, and quite often food trash left behind, cigarette butts, the noise and congregating that would take place with a lot of that, as well as visitors and students of the Westminster Choir College. It was a quality of life issue, and the hard-won arrangement arrived at has continued to serve us in the street quite well, the neighborhood. Princeton High School is the reason for over 50% of our property taxes, which, you know, is kind of onerous. And so in return, I would respectfully ask that they leave our hard-won street permit parking situation as agreed, and that we worked hard for. Listening to this morning's comments by this task force, residents should be charged nothing for parking on their own residential streets. Frankly, this is kind of an affront and rather outrageous. And as far as talking about people who work here in town, I mean, we're fairly far from where all that is. There are parking garages close to where these people work. The town, Princeton, should be, you know, securing some of those, a section of those underutilized garage spaces, rather than having them dumped here and having people having to walk, you know, to their jobs that might be a good 10-15-minute walk to where they're going, particularly in the wintertime or bad weather. They've got to, you know, if they parking right in that area and get out of their car and, you know, don't have to worry They're in a parking garage that they don't have to worry about paying for, or, you know, what have you. The September to June situation here during the school year, again, I think should be preserved. On a personal note, our house is right next to Choir College, 1 block away from the high school, and we and the neighbors across from us are in an interesting situation where we don't have a driveway that goes right up to our house where we can kind of get out with groceries or get out with whatever we might be loading or unloading and just kind of walk up a couple steps and into the house. Our driveway is as far away from the house itself as it can be in the back. That's just the way it was situated. And, you know, so we have a couple spaces back there. And so in our particular situation, as I believe it is for our neighbors across and probably the people on the other end, it's kind of imperative. We're sort of a special situation. We're having, you know, so in our case, the space right in front of our house where we actually literally have a walk that goes from our door to there. That's essentially our, you know, avenue to get into our house from the car with stuff. My wife had a stroke a few years back. That would be Alice. And she walks with a cane now, will for the rest of her life. And so at the time that happened, I secured with the police department for the time being the space that's right in front of the house where the walk just goes right there. So I don't have to worry about ever having to traverse the deck and the walk and walking through the yard if it was at night or whatever, and worry about falling or tripping or what have you, not to mention dragging in groceries or anything like that. You know, I mean, so whatever happens, and I hope, you know, a lot of this doesn't happen, but I would ask that a special dispensation be made that the space that we secured for her that's out front be preserved and retained for us. I think that's about all.
Thank you, Bruce. Next, thank you for your comments. We're going to call on Karen and then Angela.
Yeah, thanks, Leticia. Just a couple things. I appreciate the work. This is not an easy opportunity to solve, so thank you very much for all the work that's going into this. I am a little concerned from a safety perspective. I live on Moore. The drop-off is precarious at best. It's really dangerous for residents and parents. They're still doing drop-offs there, and my concern is if that parking's full, that's going to be even tighter. So I just think it's something you're going to have to take a look at if all those parking spaces are full for when school starts. Parents are still letting their kids off there. They turn around in our driveways, and I'm just concerned for the safety of the students and the residents, particularly during pickup and drop off. So if you would consider that, I would appreciate it. The other thing is because people will cluster around, right, the closest point in access points into the school, those parking spaces are going to fill up sooner. And so it's going to be very difficult for people who have contractors at their home or home health care to actually park anywhere near their home. So I appreciate that it's only 47%, but it's not like they're going to park in every other space, right? So it really is going to cluster right around the school. So I am a little worried that even though it's only 50%, it's going to be 100% for those closest into the high school and around. And so there will be zero parking for those folks. So just two things I think you need to consider as you go through this. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
for your
Karen.
input, Karen.
Yeah, I appreciate especially the comment about the drop off and pickup that happens on Moore. And that's not something we've given any thought to. I do want to remind that the student permits, just like the employee permits, can be given out block by block so that we can make sure that people, a student who's supposed to be parking on Henry, you know, is parking on Henry and not filling up all those close-in spaces, close-in student spaces. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, David. Angela?
Yeah, I have two questions regarding the permits, and I agree that we as residents, I live on Moore Street, that we shouldn't pay for it. It's enough problem as it is to have all the traffic. And I agree with Karen, definitely, that drop off and pick up times are horrendous and very dangerous because kids run in between the cars and whatnot. One thing I was thinking, what about the, what do you call a loop bus? There used to be, there is, I think there was a used loop bus that picks up between the middle school and high school, but it's only in the afternoon. It used to be in the morning, but they stopped that. I think that could help maybe a little bit of the Princeton High School kids, that if they have that opportunity to take the loop bus instead of taking a car.
Where does the loop bus go to?
It goes around the neighborhood. I know it goes Riverside and Littlebrook. It's not a town, it's a NJ Transit that organize it, but just because the morning one was not popular, this is maybe 15 years ago, they stopped the morning loop bus. But I think that could help if we could have morning and afternoon loop bus. I mean, maybe you can look into that, David. I don't know.
I'm not familiar with that. Scott, would you have any more insight on that? I think Scott's still here.
I'm sorry, I missed the question. I was taking a team photo.
Sorry, about a loop bus for.
There is a loop bus for Bun Drive that goes up to the Reading Village, Community Village. That picks up in front of the middle school at the end of the day.
Okay.
And it also goes to Riverside and Littlebrook sections. That I know for sure.
Yes. Yep, that starts there and then they come pick up at the middle school and then the destinations.
So
And
was
also-
your question whether it's continuing or suggesting
No.
that it could be expanded?
It could be expanded, so we don't have to have, I mean, I come from Sweden and we don't have any problems with parking. I mean, it's more of transportation that's in the towns. And a loop bus could be one, maybe freebie, if we could talk to the university to use that to transport kids instead of having problems with them parking.
Yeah, we're very interested in getting more kids onto the school buses, whether it's a loop bus or the regular school buses that go all around town. It's very painful to see a 55 passenger school bus with 3 kids on it, which
Yeah.
to be what I see all the time.
Yep.
But it's a culture shift.
Right.
Sure how to make it happen.
I have one more question, and that is you said permits is that per household or is it per car? Because I have 4 kids that are all for driving.
So a permit can have multiple license plates associated with it, but only if you only buy one permit, only one of those license plates can park at a time. So if you wanted to have all 4 of your kids
I
have
see.
their 4 cars on the street, you would have to buy 4 permits.
Okay, that makes sense.
If they're available.
Right.
They're available.
Thank you for that. And Bruce, Harold, I'm not sure that you still have your hand raised. Did you already ask your question or?
I did not.
Okay, go ahead. And then that will be followed by Lisa. And then I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Chi or Chat?
Chi.
Chi. Okay. So Harold, followed by Lisa, followed by Chi.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you to the group that's trying to resolve all of this. I live at 96 Jefferson, so I'm about a block and a half from the high school. Right now, we're affected by the parking behind us in the Franklin lot from the students, and Anthony is correct. And Scott, I have to disagree with you. The students just have moved their activities to the Franklin lot for right now. We several times a month have to call to ask for cleanup back there. And it's noisy and well, I haven't searched for condoms. There's lots of stuff going on back there. So at any rate, I have a number of questions and a couple of comments that maybe can be clarified. First of all, from the map that I saw, there doesn't really seem to be, at least on my block of Jefferson, any additional student or employee permits that are going to be involved, so that it's just the the contractors and the residents and visitors that will be permitted to park there. So I just want clarification on that. Right now, as a resident in the high school zone, I'm permitted 2 seasonal permits that basically have no time limits on them at all and only work during the school year. And I paid for them once. And if I lose one, then I have to pay to get it replaced. So I have some questions regarding what's going to change in terms of the fee and the permit structure. Right now, what are called long-term visitors currently can use one of my 2 resident zone permits to park. So for instance, if my kids visit me from Chicago and they want to park their SUV for the long weekend or maybe for a couple of weeks, I just give them one of my permits and they can park on the street, and I call for overnight parking to the police. So will there now be an additional separate cost or separate permit to allow my kids to park on Jefferson? Similarly, overnight parking is currently free. Will there now be a fee for overnight parking, whether it's 1 day, 3 days, 7 day, whatever it might be? Contractors, and there are a lot of contractors on my street. Somebody somewhere is doing something to roof, air conditioning, whatever it might be. Currently, they use one of my 2 or if more than one contractor, use my seasonal residential zone permit when it's during the school year. So now will I have to try to ascertain what trucks are going to be coming and get their license plates so I can go online to get a permit for them and so that they can go ahead and work, so that there'll be this additional cost and hassle for it. You know, the current permit parking right now on an annual basis is much less expensive than the proposed new fees. So it's not clear to me whether there's any new value that's being offered to the residents of the street. There may be value to defraying the cost of the software. There may be value to the non-residents, the students and employees that are going to be using the spots. But I don't see any new value that's being offered for this additional cost to the residents. A question that I don't understand is what's changed regarding the needs for the high school parking compared with 2 years ago before high school parking was allowed on the Franklin lot? What's changed? Are more kids driving? Do we need more spots? Was it not satisfactory before the Franklin lot became available? Aren't we trying to get the students not to drive? What other solutions are there for that? Is there a lot at the Westminster Choir College that's not being used that can be used rather than putting the students on the street? And finally, just a comment, all these increases in costs and additional permitting seem to be driven by the software design and the cost structure. They seem more onerous and more expensive. It's not clear to me that going to this software provides anything other than a way to charge the residents more money for no value. Thanks.
Thank you, Harold, for your input. I can actually respond to some of your questions because I also live in this neighborhood and I'm very familiar with the current permitting system. I know that as residents, we are eligible of this neighborhood, we're eligible for not 2, but actually 4 permits that we don't pay for. 2 of them are decals that can go on your car. And then the other 2 are for your visitors, those are placards. So you actually get 4 permits that, yes, we don't currently pay for it. As far as, but we're not right now, overnight parking, it's not allowed. And I know folks have been historically calling the police department to notify the police that you have visitors that will be parking overnight, providing the car model and make and license plate in order for them not to be issued a citation for parking overnight. The police, we're actually working to discourage that. It's been a burden on the police at times when it tends to be, some have taken advantage of it, of calling on a regular basis to have, because there's no limit on how many times someone can call the police to request, to notify them that someone will be parking overnight in front of their house. So we are working to, and it's not equal. It's not actually, it's not across the board for all neighborhoods where that's even possible. So we're working, as we work post consolidations, to harmonize all of our ordinances. Parking is one of them. And you asked about student parking. Actually, we're not looking to increase the number of students who are allowed a permit, who are allowed to park. It's because they're losing the Franklin lot, and also they've also lost Walnut, the ability to park on Walnut, because that's where the buses are not parking. And so so they are losing spaces that we're trying, working to accommodate.
They didn't have the Franklin spaces before them.
But they had other areas. So it's their number of permits that they've had has not increased.
Can it going to still be the case?
Yes, they're not asking for additional permits. But I'm trying to think other questions that as far as why change now. You know, we are working to, you know, somebody, I think, I don't know if it was you or somebody else mentioned, as far as employees being considered of employees, not having to have to walk too far in order to park. Well, they're already parking pretty far and having to walk to work. And it's really for employees, some of them who are living paycheck to paycheck, it's really not, it's not possible for them to be parking in the garage and have to pay for parking. And I don't know, as you know, if we are expecting for the municipality to provide that parking that is taxpayer funded, you know, that's something that if that's what we want to consider, that's, you know, that put it out to everyone, because it won't be just the residents of this neighborhood who are being asked to pay for a permitting system. It's really, and not everybody's going to be obligated to buy a permit. It's only those who want one, who don't have adequate parking on their driveway. And as far as the vendors, contractors, they're not required, you're not required to purchase a permit for your contractors. Already it's understood that the police, if they know that you have a contractor working on your house, they're not going to issue citations to the contractor, especially one that it's clearly, you know, clearly a contractor, the truck or van.
Okay, so
were there other
I just
questions
want to
that-
jump in for a second.
Yeah,
Leticia,
go ahead, David.
Because there's a little inconsistency between what you just said and what I presented. So
With,
I think that I had talked about the short-term permits being
Yeah,
used
well-
for contractors as well as for other overnight guests or.
but that wouldn't apply for areas where there's 3-hour parking. If it's more than 3 hours.
Well,
Right.
because most contracts.
Right, but what you were saying and what the current system is that contractors do park all day and the police have an unwritten rule that they
No.
do not enforce the existing parking regulations.
No, the homeowner
contractors.
contacts, sorry, David, the homeowner, I know the homeowner's supposed to contact, to notify about contractors working on their home.
So the point that I'm trying to make is there are two different ways to handle contractors. One is to require permits for them, and the other is to not require permits for them. And I think this task force has been to input from the residents as to which they would prefer. I think, you know, in some neighborhoods, and actually there's a third option, which is to require the contractors to pay for the permits. And that could also possibly be set up, although it's a little bit harder to enforce because you could have a contractor coming saying that they're working on a certain house. They could come and be parking all the time, even when they're not working on the house. So but I think there are three options, and I think that it's great to get input from the neighbors in terms of which they think is the most appropriate way to handle contractors.
So Letitia and David, I still need some clarification. I can't speak to people abusing overnight parking or not. I don't think that I abuse it. It's just for visitors who we don't have parking space for. And I do understand that it's a hassle for the police, particularly where there's abuse involved. But what's not clear to me is for those of us in the neighborhood, including my street, who now have, okay, you call it 4 permits, which are the 2 for the stickers and 2 hanging ones. Is that going to change? It looks like now you're going to have to pay $30 a quarter for each one of those. Whereas right now, essentially, if you don't lose your hanging ones and you remember to let the town know that you've gotten a new car and they give you another sticker to replace the one you had before, when you show proof of that what was now essentially, after we paid a single permit, was free and gives us some flexibility to offer the hanging tag to contractors or to visitors for during the day parking. Way that basically the permitting that we have right now is going to be replaced by quarterly charges plus contractor permits plus overnight permits. Is that correct?
That's correct. But I just want to make the point, if you look at the foundational principles this committee's been working with, we've been trying to figure out how to share parking equitably between several different user groups. And I want to remind everybody that the roads are public property. They're not the property of the residents who live on the streets. So we have employees of local businesses. We want our local businesses to thrive. We don't want to impose large costs on low wage employees. So we're looking for a lower cost solution for parking for employees than building more parking garages and charging thousands of dollars a year to somebody to foot the bill for those parking garages. So that's one user group. Another user group is customers of local businesses, and a third group is the residents and their guests and visitors. And we want to try to accommodate all of those users rather than just accommodate residents. And basically the system that you have in your neighborhood currently is catering only to residents and to none of the other user groups in town. And so I think that's just a basic foundation of what we're trying to do with this program, is to share the parking rather than exclusively limit it to the residents. And it's public parking. So I think that it's a reasonable way to approach the issue.
I appreciate all of that, David. The result is it costs us all more money.
But it doesn't, if you don't need permits.
What's happening is that our ability to use that space is being limited and it's costing us more. There's no logic in that.
There is logic in that.
The logic is
in this neighborhood, not everybody needs on-street parking. It's a luxury. You've got off-street parking that is readily available. And, to say that nobody else can use the parking because you want the occasional luxury of being able to park on the street in front of your house that's what doesn't make sense to me.
That's not what I'm saying, David. What I'm saying is that I park in my garage, okay, and every once in a while I need to have parking used by a visitor or a contractor. And right now I don't pay any more than the single permit and the $20,000 a year in taxes to have that quote luxury, okay? And now you want to charge me hundreds of dollars more a year for the couple of times a month, I might need to have somebody park out front.
That's not
Yeah.
true.
Sense.
That's not true
No.
because we have the short-term permits. There's a couple of times a year that you need a contractor to park. And I'm even offering that we can have the contractor pay for the permit and not you pay for the permit. So it's really not the way that this is planned.
So we
Yeah.
do need to move on to, there's other, Michelle, did you want to say something?
I just want to summarize too that, I mean, the idea of this is to take input and we want to try and be fair across the board for all the residential communities. And right now it's different in different communities, but we're going to take these comments back and digest them. I just want to mention too, Harold, I totally agree with you. I really don't think students should be driving to school. So I think that one thing, because it impacts this community greatly in this residential zone, is to, and I will be following up with school board members and our school liaison to talk about really the necessity for this many and what maybe some other possible solutions are, because the 90 permits, it does impact greatly in this area. And the fact that the kids aren't using the buses as much is also a concern. So we'll take a look at that as well.
Thank you for your input. Chi, did you remind me, did you go already or?
No, I haven't.
Go ahead and you will be followed by Lisa.
Okay. So I just wanted to speak to the question, at the very beginning, I think at the first slide of they wanted feedback from people on Hamilton, which is where I am between Moore and Walnut, of whether people we would welcome, bike lanes being installed or the spaces being removed. And for me, I would only be for that, the spaces being removed from our street, if the bike lanes were definitely installed with traffic calming measures so that the bike lanes were safe and used. Because what I definitely would not want on Hamilton Avenue, which is already too busy as a residential street, is for traffic to increase in volume and increase in speed. So, so I just wanted to answer that question. I'm kind of confused about where this draft proposal is. Like, is that part of the end of that big 76-page report, or is there a different proposal? Someone said at the very beginning, it's still draft because you're getting input from residents. Is that a different proposal that we can actually read? Because this conversation seems to be more about people parking or
Yes, it is. So you're right. The 76-page report, I think, was the Hamilton Wiggins corridor study, which was exactly about traffic calming and the traffic in the corridor, and secondarily about parking in the corridor. This is about parking in the area, and it's a supplemental study that's being done to try to address the question of bicycle lanes on Hamilton Wiggins, only in part. That's a small part of what this is about, but it was asked by council that we try to take on that issue of what to do about that parking. And the plan is absolutely to do the traffic calming if we do take, if we put in the bike lanes there. And I wanted to address one of the points in the chat. This is related to the bike lanes. And the point that I like to make is that bike lanes are not just for bicyclists. They're for pedestrians, because right now bicyclists ride on the sidewalks and it's unsafe for pedestrians. It's also for the drivers, because right now bicyclists weave in and out of empty and full parking spaces. And it's a harrowing experience to drive on Hamilton Wiggins when there are bicyclists out. And so the point that I want to, and in New York City, when they put in their bike lanes, they actually did a study and found that the driving time between destinations on average went down 15%. In other words, drivers got where they were going more readily once they had bike lanes to both help remove some cars from the road, because some people ride their bikes instead of driving once you have bike lanes, and also because the behavior is more predictable and the traffic flows more smoothly. So bike lanes are for all roadway users. And I just want to make people cognizant of that and help them to appreciate that it's not just for bicyclists.
Yeah, so so as long as, you know, moving those parking spaces wouldn't increase the traffic speeds or traffic volume, if it was something that would calm the traffic on the street, would be the only way that, you know, I myself would be for that. I wanted to, is this proposal then available somewhere or not yet?
This presentation?
No. Like, is there a proposal that has been drafted, or you're still gathering information? So
We're still gathering information.
Okay.
So the next step after we, because we have been soliciting input from different neighborhoods that are being considered, then the next step will be presented to council.
Okay. And
So,
then the proposal will be available for everybody to look at.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
So then, I just want to make a comment about the people who had spoken about paying for their spot in front of their house. That like a vibrant downtown benefits all residents of Princeton, I believe. And so I also do believe that all residents of Princeton should share that cost of, say, the employees that need parking to get to their job. So I don't know, you know, how that would be done, whether they would be given spots in municipal lots, or the business owners could pass on free parking ideally to the employees. But it doesn't seem fair that if you live close to downtown that you would shoulder that burden more, given that a vibrant downtown is one of the pluses of being in Princeton, and that's shared equally by everybody who lives in Princeton. So that was just a comment. And then I have two questions. If the parking spaces were taken away from Hamilton and bike lanes were put in, I've had the experience, I've lived here for 12 years now, that I cannot find a parking space. You know, I have a single lane driveway, so it's hard for my guests to park in my driveway without like everybody having to back out if one person needs to leave. But I did look at that study, and I wasn't surprised to find that in the middle of the day on my block, it's 100% occupied on my street. So I, as a resident, am not able to park on my street at all. And so, you know, talking about what you had said, David, that on Hawthorne, maybe the parking is only for the residents there. I find that on Hamilton, as a resident, I don't get to use my parking in the middle of the day. So if the parking spaces would be removed, would I, as a Hamilton Avenue resident, get a parking permit for my guests to come? Because as it is now, it's very hard for anybody visiting me to park on my block.
So are you talking about short-term visitors for under 3?
Yeah, short-term visitors.
So, I mean, so one of the benefits of this is that spaces will be available on the street, on the side streets, for guests and visitors to residents of Hamilton Wiggins, where
Like
they're not a
permit, or just looking for those free?
no permits needed as long as they're parking for less than 3 hours. There'll be
so
free
available
on-street parking, no permit required up to 3 hours.
which is not possible now because
Which is not possible now.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably parked up too with employee parking there. So, that's one of the reasons too, that this will free up some of those, those
And
spaces.
I really think that the parking on my street is actually high school students and office workers because it's filled up midday and not on the weekend. So I don't think these are retail workers or restaurant workers that are parking on my block. I personally know people who park on my street and then walk up to Nassau to go to offices. So I
Okay.
think high school students and office workers who are taking up the spaces here. So sorry, one last final question. My question is, how come on Wiggins it's 2-hour limited parking and then 1 block later it goes to completely unrestricted? That seems like a giant jump between what's allowed on Wiggins and what's allowed on Hamilton.
So the thinking is that those first 6 spaces on Wiggins, or 12 spaces on Wiggins between Witherspoon and Van Deventer are needed for customer parking. The ones that are past Van Deventer are far enough from businesses that customers probably wouldn't park there anyway. So those can be made available to employees who work all day, who need all day long parking. So that's the rationale for it.
I think that from west from Moore, so between Moore and Van Deventer, I think it's 2-hour limited parking there. And it's only,
Yes.
yeah, it's only after Moore.
After Moore.
So.
Correct.
Okay, but the rationale is probably still the same. They're thinking.
Yes, that's the
Moore
rationale.
West is customers, Moore and East are employees. Okay.
Thank you for your input, Chi. Next, I'm going to call on Lisa next, followed by Tinica and then Virginia.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you, Permit Parking Task Force. I know that what you're taking on is a gargantuan task, but I applaud you for your persistence in looking for solutions. And I want to remind everybody on this call that we as a town are a very popular place, not only for visitors, but even in the last year, as a result of the pandemic, there are families that are moving here because of its walkable and bikeable downtown and its quality of life in comparison to many other towns around us. It's also because of our school system, the proximity of the university. And I think we all need to take one big step back and look at all of the benefits that we have here in this town. I need to introduce myself on several fronts. I'm the chair of the Pedestrian and Bicycle Advisory Committee. I'm also employed by Greater Mercer Transportation Management Association as a safety instructor for Safe Routes to School and for the Street Smart program, which alerts both drivers and pedestrians about things they need to do to be safer. It is also my responsibility as a parent to let you know that I have a teenage sophomore at the high school who would like to ride his bicycle to school, and it would be a lot easier and more and safer if there were bike lanes on Hamilton and Wiggins. And he's only one of, I don't know how many students, but there are many that are like him that would like to ride on their bikes to school, both to the high school and the middle school. So my first question is, and I go back to what Harold was saying in terms of, aren't we trying to get kids to change their behavior? Well, if we provide them infrastructure, I believe they will. And it's, if you build it, they will come kind of approach. This idea of bike lanes was already tested back in 2018. It was very successful. We had surveys, we had opportunities for people to speak and there was a lot of support for the bike lanes. And the only reason that they didn't last very long was because there is parking that has been on Wiggins and Hamilton that would need to move. Now, I also recognize that employees need to find places so that they can afford to work in Princeton. And that's why this permit parking task force is working hard to find solutions to many people's problems in terms of parking. The other big question you need to recognize is that we are, as a town, becoming denser. The hospital became a 300-unit apartment and condominium area. There are businesses that are closing as a result. The space that they occupied is becoming condominiums. You're finding what used to be a business is now 6 units. It's going to again bring higher density. So these whole big issues of parking are something that everybody really needs to get their heads wrapped around in a very strategic way long term. I'd like to address a couple of questions that I had specifically. One is the Franklin lot that everyone's pointing to, which is not part of the high school permits. Do we know how many cars are in the old normal were parking in that lot, so that we at least can get our hands around what was that behavior in the past?
Lisa, I can answer that very quickly. That
Yes.
used to be actually was municipal, only for municipal parking.
Are you talking about the paved area or are you talking about the
The
gravel
paved area.
Okay,
I
I'm
thought
talking
that's
about
what
the
you were
gravel
asking.
area that's close to Moore, because that's where I have witnessed many students park and walk across Moore into the high school. So that's the section that I'm looking at. The second point that was brought up by, I guess, both Karen and Ingela is about pickup and drop off. And that's something that in my professional capacity, we could help the high school in terms of talking through how to make that smoother and frankly, safer means of transiting between in and out of the cars, in and out of Moore Street, in and out of Houghton, in and out of Walnut. And I know that there are solutions that can be attempted. We can run trials, and I'm happy to talk to the school staff about them. And then as far as student behavior, I can't address that, but I can tell you that if they were riding their bikes, they wouldn't be dropping cigarette butts in the Franklin lot. They wouldn't be doing other perhaps misdemeanor activities, because their bikes are not a shelter for them to be able to do that. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you for your input, Lisa. Next, I'm going to call on Tineke and then Virginia, followed by Bob. Alice, I see you have your hand raised, but I'm giving the option to those who haven't yet had an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Leticia, and thank you to all the task force members for all their work on this. I have a comment about student parking. When my daughters were at the high school, I always asked them to walk or bike to school. And the reason is that, well, it gets them a breath of fresh air. They are couch potatoes like me, but I knew that getting physical exercise before arriving at school is really good for you and really good for your grades. This is just, many studies have shown this. So like Lisa, I am all in favor of encouraging active transportation for the students. So I think it doesn't make sense for student parking to be free, because there is a nudge in the price. And if it's free, a lot more students are going to come and use their cars. I think it's perfectly all right to ask students and their families to pay for their use of the public space, and that is part of the price of car ownership, which, I mean, if you look at the Edmunds websites, they have this true to cost thing where you can figure out what the real cost is of owning a car, including insurance and blah, blah, blah. And it amounts to $250 to $500 per month, depending on the car you drive. And it seems to me that, you know, a $10 fee for parking is small compared to that amount. So I understand that the town gets that the fee is paid by the high school, but I think it would be better if the students see what it costs. I think I really like the license plate technology. I think that it will reduce the number of students that come to park in our neighborhood without a student permit. And we haven't talked about those yet, but I know for a fact that many students come to school by car without a parking permit. And so the license plates technology will, I believe, reduce the number of those students. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for your input. Virginia, followed by Bob. You need to unmute yourself.
Find it. All right.
There you
I'm just going to echo the thanks that everybody else has given to this task force, because it is a daunting project. And I think the goals are great to try to create an equitable system that responds to all needs. I'm going to start with one question, and this goes back to the high school allocation, because I thought the PowerPoint said there was going to be an increase of 47 to 90 spaces, but then I thought you said, Tutsia, that there would be no increase. So I'm a little bit confused about that.
So the spots, the additional spots that are being mentioned here, are those to accommodate the spaces that are being lost by when students will not be able to use the Franklin lot? You know, we already experienced the Walnut Lane when that students lost the ability to park there already. So then then the Franklin lot is next. We're looking to accommodate those spaces.
I think there might even actually be a slight decrease. I think there used to be 100.
Yes, there's a decrease of 10 on it. It used to be 100, now it's at 90.
All right, well, there was something that said 47 to 90 that I wrote down, and maybe I was misreading it.
No,
The
what I want to
47
explain.
spots are the 25 on Guillaume and 22 on Franklin, and then the additional to get up to 90 is what would it be?
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. And I'm just going to add to say I agree with the points that many of my neighbors have made, including the point that we should not be going out of our way to incentivize student driving. I am concerned about the enforcement technology. I'm concerned about handling the parking issue through a presumably a for-profit vendor who's going to be making money, putting our license plate information, all of this license plate information in, and then somehow monitoring the parking through some sort of surveillance of the license plates. And I understand, of course, why it's important to have some sort of monitoring system. And I understand that there have been shortcomings in the monitoring. Am I still on?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing. There have been some shortcomings in the monitoring system in this neighborhood. At the same time, it's not obvious to me that the solution is to go full high tech on this. And I don't know why we couldn't consider a permit system that was a little bit more old style, which first of all is going to respond to this cost issue. And just to think about the problems with monitoring that come up and maybe come up with a more old-fashioned way of dealing with it. I don't really quite understand actually how the license plate monitoring technology is going to work. So maybe somebody could explain that to me briefly, but just as an overarching matter, I find the whole idea of our paying for the surveillance, this kind of surveillance, troublesome. Because, and so that's one comment. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to quickly address that when as part of the presentation to council, the proposal would also include a presentation on the parking technology. So everyone will be able to see how the system works, but also if there's any questions that can be addressed at that time.
I want to emphasize, Virginia, that the actual enforcement will happen the way, will be done by municipal employees. The enforcement will not be done by the for-profit company. The permits will be issued using using a website that's run by a for-profit company, and they will take a cut of the money, but the municipality will receive the fees, the permit fees, and the municipality will thereby pay our employees to do the enforcement. And, it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of price. If we do it old school, we'll need more employees, because it's slower for the employees to go around and mark down every license plate, which they by hand, which they have to do to keep track of who's parking, for 3 hours. All that stuff has to happen by hand, or it has to happen by computer. And so if you don't have the computers to increase the productivity of those employees, you need more employees to do the enforcement.
Well, okay, David, thanks for that. I'm still a skeptic. I still think this is troublesome, and somehow that computer is going to have to know where cars are. I don't know. Are you going to put cameras out on the street? Is that going to be part of it?
They're on the enforcement vehicle. It's a camera on top of the vehicle.
Okay, so it's going to be some sort of version of what we're dealing with now with the new meters that have been installed, where they can look and see what's happening. I would just really urge the task force to reconsider this. And I'm, I understand what you're saying about higher personnel costs, but there may be sort of, I don't know whether you're thinking about hiring more members of the police force, which would be costly, but maybe there are alternative ways of doing that. But, given all of that my neighbors have said about, the costs, it is troublesome. And those of us who live in this neighborhood are used to our system, which we work very hard to put in place. And, now it's going to change. And it's like you're taking this away and you're going to force me to pay. But then I'm going to be paying some software company, which is going to get information about my license plates and my guests. And, they're going to know who's fixing my house. There are a lot of kind of dystopian possibilities here that that I tend to think about, and I don't want to exaggerate, but I am a little bit. But I'm just hoping that this meeting that you are now having with this neighborhood is not a meeting. I'm hoping that what we are saying is going to have an impact, and that we are not essentially dealing with a done deal decision by this task force, because that would be very troublesome.
Virginia, I want to comment too. The technology, if you would wait to see the technology, because we're also talking about the purchasing of the permits, or getting the permits is also very cumbersome on our clerk's office. This would all be, it'd all be high tech. It would all be online. So and, you know, and that helps tremendously as well. So let's look at that. And as Leticia and David said, we're going to do a presentation to council on the technology piece. But we're being cognizant that it's 11 o'clock already and we still have some speakers. We can do kind of a wrap up and say that there's quite a few questions we want to take back. I mean, one question I think for the school board, and what we really need to talk about, is the number and the other opportunities for student parking, or, you know, I do really see that as a big burden for this residential neighborhood. I think that we need to take back to and look at what has been traditional as far as what you are used to having in terms of the parking permits, and see, you know, what we can do for the residential neighborhood. I think that I'm hearing some really good feedback about sharing and having employees be able to park on all the streets and sharing the streets and helping the vitality of the downtown. And I'm hearing that, and I am also hearing that disabled maybe and financial dispensation, if we do go forward with the paid, you know, permit parking, we tried to make it as nominal as possible, but there may be some way of having dispensation for those various pieces. And maybe there needs to also be something for contractors where that we can do a waiver for a certain period of time. So I'm, you know, those are kind of the notes that I've taken, and just wrapping up from the comments. And because we have recorded this, we can save the comments, but I know that there's a few more people that want to make comments, and then we should probably wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And, you know, and when we do present to council, there will be more opportunity for, you know, as we take into consideration the public input from the different neighborhoods, because it's not just this neighborhood that has been has had issues with parking needs, meeting the parking needs. In this I live in this neighborhood. I know it's unique. Before coming here, I lived in what was the former township, and was not an issue at all. But sorry, going to mute someone. But so you know, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to consider, as you know, and this is part of the process for us. We want to hear from you. We want to take into consideration your concerns and your input, but keep in mind that we're also listening to residents from other neighborhoods who have their own challenges. And there's some neighborhoods that we haven't yet had meetings with, including the western section, who could accommodate employee parking there as well. So it's not, you know, everybody, every neighborhood is going to be asked to work together on this, to address the needs, you know, not just our needs as residents, but also of our employees, the employees of our local businesses, and our visitors. With that, I wanted to pass it on to Bob, and followed by Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks and sympathy to all the members of the third rail of parking task force. The people who worked on the parking meter, maybe they learned that demand management wasn't that popular with those whose demand was being managed. So, you know, fingers crossed on this one too. And as David mentioned, yeah, bike lanes are good for pedestrians and cars too, but you got to include that not so good for the parking that's removed to put in the bike lane. So you need to include that situation here. Even just if we're talking about the 3 blocks east of Hamilton, that's 50 spaces, and those are well used in, you know, when it's not pandemic times. And I'm wondering where those spaces going to go. It's a lot of additional pressure on an already tight situation to take out 50 spaces. The proposal in the presentation seemed to say that there will be permits to replace those 50 spaces, but really there are no new spaces being created, right? It's just math.
There are, Bob.
Where are the spaces being created, the 50 spaces?
The 50 spaces, there are over 100 spaces between Humbert, Greenview, first block of Jefferson, first block of Moore, and Hawthorne, none of which provide employee parking right now.
But those spaces have cars in them, right?
What?
Those spaces have cars in them. Those are not new spaces, right?
They do not.
So these are spaces that previously had no parking
Right.
permitted by,
The high school parking permit regime right now is a permit regime that's intended to eliminate parking, not permit parking. Basically, the high school area zone is a permit system to prevent students from parking, but it also prevents anybody else from parking. So those spaces, if we create this permit system, will become available to other users besides students.
so like, forget pandemic years, but like 2 years ago, those spaces would have no cars in them. And now
Correct.
with this system, they will have, the 50 cars will be there.
That's correct.
And the people that live along those streets that will now have cars parked in front of them, permit, whatever, they're okay with that.
That's what this meeting is to find out. But
Got it,
you know,
okay.
we're trying to be fair and make sure that there are still spaces available for them as well as for the employees. So we're only parking 50% of the spaces with employee permits.
And I want to point out that the current permitting system in this neighborhood is only applies from the beginning of September to the end of June. And only from the hours, gosh, I didn't write down the hours, but it's only
Right.
during when school's in
It's
session.
school time, yeah.
Yes, so the rest of the day, anybody can park,
Right,
and on the
Okay.
weekends.
okay. So we are essentially creating 50 new spaces where there was no space, nobody was parking before.
Correct.
That's kind of amazing for Princeton, so congratulations. It would be good to see has anybody surveyed the people that are currently parking on Hamilton? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but it wouldn't be that hard to survey. Well, it would be hard this year, but I mean, next year it wouldn't be that hard to survey who's using it and, you know, whether they're really high school students or office workers or retail workers or whatever. It wouldn't be that hard. Anyway, suggestion for additional work. Thanks for your help.
Thank you. And I want to address, before going on to Elizabeth, address one of the comments on the chat about employees being able to park for free. They would not be free permits, and these would be, only the employer would be eligible to purchase those permits. Employees themselves would not be able to apply to get a permit. But I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. Elizabeth, you.
Oh, thank you very much, Letitia. This is actually Betty Wolf.
Oh, Betty.
People are wondering.
Betty, hi.
I want to compliment everybody in this meeting, the public and the task force members, and particularly you and David, who are doing a great job of backing each other up. And you've covered sort of philosophical and civic issues as well as the nitty gritty stuff.
Thank you.
I don't need to have answers to this, but I'd like to just mention a few sort of elephants in the room. One of which is the Choir College property, which is actually huge and in limbo at the moment. And I know you can only plan for the present and the foreseeable future, but that's something that the whole town is got to be dealing with, and particularly in this neighborhood plan. And the other thing that I just haven't heard people mention is the variable width of Hamilton, and the fact that even right now, the last block of Hamilton as it approaches Harrison, that would be driving east, is so narrow that there are log jams all the time, whether it's a contractor doing work or PSE&G and all the work that's being done on the installation of broadband or whatever, and also the giant lawn care vehicles that are really, they're amazing. They're like FedEx and UPS trucks these days, only they don't just stop for a second. They hang in there for the day. And I think that particular area needs special study. But I guess what I'm asking is, I realize this is just one little part of town. But before and as you go along with future meetings, I think that we're not generally aware as residents of Greater Princeton municipality, of there being a real agreement on cost sharing of a growing, hooray, central business district, and the becoming more denser of our town. I'm sure that other towns have gone through this process. And I'm sure that input from other towns who are dealing with the same sort of social awareness and the kind of changes that hopefully climate change brings to a town with transportation. I'm just hoping that we can start our final discussion with the bigger picture in mind, because there is going to be there are going to be changes for everybody, which will either be valued as pluses or minuses. But I think it will help if we start by really just sort of reading the mission statement at the beginning of every discussion of this is part of this overall issue of how do we deal with all the social issues that are behind this, whether it's climate change, affordable housing, or just plain Princeton growing and how Princeton zones and doesn't zone in terms of making special development districts. And the other elephant in the room that hasn't been mentioned for this particular neighborhood is the fact that we have a shopping center within easy walking distance for high school and middle school students. And I just haven't heard anything about using that at all. So thank you very much. And this has been actually just an incredibly A++ superior civic meeting from my experience since 1980.
Wow. Thank you, Betty. We truly appreciate your input, appreciate everyone's input. Before we wind down, I did want to share, talk about what's next. I mentioned already that as the task force will take all the input that we've received, including from the other neighborhoods, before we draft our proposal that we will be presented to council, to mayor and council in the near future. We are going to share the presentation that was what David presented today, as well as the recording. I think I'm going to ask our webmaster to set up a page where we can include also, I think it would be helpful for you to see what the existing parking, permit parking ordinances are, as well as what applies to the different neighborhoods, what some of our neighbors are paying to be able to park on their street when they have limited parking, as well as what the go over what the current overnight parking system is, and what why we're looking into proposing a change in that. There are several questions in the chat function that we didn't get to, so which we also had from other neighborhood meetings. And what we're going to do is we're going to take those questions and condense them into a FAQ document that we could also share on this page that we want to provide all the information regarding the permit parking system, and hopefully answer some of your questions there if they weren't answered here. But before we close, I did want to give an opportunity for members of the task force. If you want to comment, raise your hand and then I'll call on you. I don't see anybody else. David, Michelle, do you wish to comment?
You know, I think I already did some summarizing, and Betty's, I think, but her comments really kind of summarize as well, and I appreciate those. So I mean, I think we can probably wrap up. I think an FAQ and a follow-up would be good. There's a lot of things that are still hanging out there and some really good comments. I think Scott mentioned, Scott Goldsmith with the high school, that they are talking with Westminster. So that does answer one question, one elephant in the room, as Betty said. So I think we're ready to wrap up unless anybody else, David or Michael. Oh, Michael.
Michael and
sorry.
Scott, do you want to make any final comments?
I just wanted to thank everybody for their time today. There was a lot of good input that I will bring back to our administration here at the high school. Hopefully we can get working together, and the community is important for everybody. And the high school is a big addition in that part of the community, and students, I'm here to advocate for them as well. But we all do a pretty good job of getting along, and parking is not the thing that'll, be the bind between us. So thanks for everybody's input, and we look forward to getting solutions done.
Thank you, Scott. Michael?
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, support a question that was just asked in chat and probably could be addressed quickly. What is the timetable, basically? It's regarding the Franklin lot and the proposed housing sort of timetable. The car, not so much the number of cars generated, but there's going to be a need for parking on the street there for whatever purpose. Can you briefly speak to that? Because it's going to be an impact.
Well, go ahead, David.
Current conversations about the parking for the Franklin development are that there's going to be underground garage parking, but that we can help control the costs of that project by giving some of the spaces that are on street on Franklin to the residents of the development as well, and reducing the amount of garage space that has to be built. So there are two things that are being talked about. One is just taking the existing spaces, which are already metered with a kiosk. They're not controlled by the permit regime, and they're often empty. So just giving those spaces to the development. There's also some conversation about widening Franklin so that it could be parking on both sides of the street. But that's not a done deal. It's just under consideration.
Yeah, but there will be parking on the site as well. It's not going to all be.
Yeah, in the garage. That's
Michael, did you have anything else?
No.
Okay. Joanne?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming out on a Saturday morning.
Yes, and no, this has been, it really has been a great community meeting. I think we really appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday to join us, and your input is, like I said, appreciated and welcome, and we'll take your comments into consideration. And I will be sharing, I know several of you probably receive notification of this message either through the newsletter, Mayor and Council's newsletter, but some of you through there's a community neighborhood listserv. So I'll make sure to continue sharing any upcoming meetings with Anita so that we can continue to pass that information on to you. But thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you taking the time.
enjoy the lovely weekend.
Yes,
Take care,
enjoy the
everyone.
rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.